Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second in the Daily Maverick series of cybersecurity webinars events. My name is Karen Allen, and today our focus is on ethical AI and social interactions. I need to thank our sponsors, the cybersecurity company F-Secure, for making this event possible and making their services available. And you can reach out to them directly by clicking on the chat window on the screen. And I hope to make this next hour as interactive as possible. So please don't hold back on your questions. You can put those in the chat. Now, my guests today are Dr. Mari-Sanna Paukkeri, the CEO of Utopia Analytics. It's a Finnish tech firm which prides itself on ethical AI. Welcome to you, Mari-Sanna. I also have with me Avani Singh, who's a South African data rights activist and lawyer. Welcome to both of you. Well, for starters, we're framing the conversation around the promise and perils of artificial intelligence through the lens of social interactions. And by this, we mean the social media platforms through which we communicate, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, Reddit, or even dating sites, or the comments pages of online publications. But before we get into the details, I want to ask my two guests a simple question. What do we mean by ethical artificial intelligence, ethical AI? Just a few sentences each, please. We'll get to you to be able to elaborate a little more as the discussion progresses. But just in a few sentences, first of all, Dr. Mari-Sanna, what do you see ethical AI as being?
AI can be a very powerful tool, and we definitely need ethical guidelines how that kind of tool is used, because it is a tool for us humans, and we want a helper, not something that makes us feel worse than what we were before. So when building AI tools, which are computer programs, nothing else, so those need to be built in a way that they save our lives. And for example, when talking about content moderation, ethical AI tools would help us to have freedom of speech instead of restricting certain opinions, for example.
Thank you. Avani, over to you. Avani Singh, for you, what's ethical AI?
So Karen, there's an interesting debate taking place at the moment around whether or not it's correct to frame it as the lens of AI within the framework of ethics as opposed to human rights. And I think ethical AI is very useful provided that it raises the bar to what human rights provide for. So for example, when we talk about ethical AI, what we want to see is the protection and promotion of fundamental rights like freedom of expression, access to information, privacy, equality, non-discrimination, and access to a meaningful remedy. But in addition to that, and if you take those as being the minimum requirements, because that is what international law requires, there are additional requirements that we might look at when we talk about ethical AI, such as transparency, accountability, openness, and processes of due diligence. And I think a confluence of those factors really speak to ethical AI for me.
Lovely, thank you both. Well, Mari-Sanna, before we explain a little bit more about what content moderation is, just whilst we're touching on the issue of ethics, if you like, you have a contract that clients must follow, and it's based on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But how do you actually check that? How do you make sure that at least the clients that you're interacting with have the same ethical principles as you have?
We assume our customers to follow United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we assume ourselves to do the same. So we have written that to the contracts. We actually receive data from our clients, how they have been following that, how they have been doing moderation, and our AI is able to measure and analyze how they meet the criteria. So in the big picture, we can see if there are certain human moderators who moderate differently than others, and compare those to each other, and also the general policy, moderation policy, what they are following.
So you use that basically as a baseline. You're not starting at zero. You've got, in a sense, the behavior of the potential client to use as your sort of baseline assessment.
We couldn't do that because we need to remember that every country is different and every culture is different. So, and we as a company, we can't know how situation is somewhere else and what kind of things are appreciated and not appreciated somewhere else. So we always define that our customer says what is okay behavior on their platform, and we provide a tool to which follow the same guidelines on the platform, but in big volumes. So when humans are checking if the users follow the guidelines, they can't do much. So it is very limited what we humans can read and check. But AI can be used then for big volumes.
So we're going to talk in a minute about what you actually do. And I do need to get you to speak to me like I'm a 4-year-old on this, because I'm assuming a lot of people don't necessarily understand the principle of content moderation. So if you go onto the Utopia Analytics website, you describe yourself as specialists in text analytics and content moderation. To a lay person, what does that mean?
Most of us, we have been participating in online discussions, at least reading in news comments or in chat or in games where there are discussions between the users or dating profiles, as you said. And moderation means that those platforms who provide this service, they don't want to publish every content the other users provide on the platform. So for example, if there's hate speech, or if there's other kind of improper content, or if there's spam, the service provider wants to take that content out. This is the moderation. And when we use AI, Utopia AI moderator to moderate, basically it's then AI tool that learns how the human moderators have been doing the moderation work, like accepting the messages and declining for publishing on that platform. Our AI takes those human decisions as the training data, and then the AI does the same what humans did, but in big volumes.
And just to provide us some context, Avani, this is the kind of thing that is going on in South Africa as well, in terms of the sites that South Africans may be using. I think even many of our newspapers and our online papers may start to use machine learning to be able to respond and interact with people.
So I think there's a couple of really interesting ways in which AI is being used by South African companies, particularly media platforms and so on. It's being used, for example, to sift through large volumes of data to generate stories, in some instances to write stories from scratch. But I think increasingly it's being used to moderate or curate the platforms to determine what is being put out. And that has tremendous benefits. But I suppose, and one thing that I'm sure we're going to discuss a bit more, are the risks involved with that. Issues around prior restraints of speech, issues around the human bias and the bias in the data that feeds into those data sets, and some of the challenges that gives rise to as well.
You've read my script. That's absolutely right. And those are exactly the issues that we want to get into. But just before we get into that detail, what is the benefit, Mari-Sanna, of having machines do the work? Is it simply about efficiency? Is it about accuracy? Because it's still hard to understand how a machine can, with something that is often quite nuanced, how it can take on the role of a human being in moderating.
You can think about a production line. So you get bottles of milk, for example. You assume them to be looking the same every time when you buy it, and having the qualities what they had last time. So AI is the same for content moderation. You suppose the moderation to be working in the same way every time you type a new comment. And that is the best part of AI. It is consistent, and it doesn't have feelings, or it isn't tired like us humans are when we would do moderation work. And it also notices all the little things where we humans may just skip over part of the text. Also, there's speed. AI can process a new comment in real time. We humans, we need some seconds to look at, and if we don't have time, it will take many hours or many days even to moderate certain content. So in order to have content or messages pre-moderated before they are published, AI is basically the only option to have lively discussion on the platform.
Well, we've got a question from Kathleen Powell, who's said, how does the content moderation algorithm actually work? What do you say to the algorithm? And an algorithm, as I understand it, is a set of rules by which processors sort of abide. How does it actually work?
So Utopia AI moderator has a unique algorithm how it works, as all AIs are. So they are separate program codes and all of them work in a different way. Utopia AI moderator works in a way that it receives human moderation decisions. So comments and the decision whether to accept or decline this comment as the training data. And then it learns what was actually the semantic meaning, the meaning in the comment, what made the human say that this is declined. And the tool learns it by itself, totally automatically. So we don't need to give separate rules for that look at these words or look at something else in the comments. It learns it from the data automatically. And what is important, this works for any language and any dialects in the world. So it takes only 2 weeks to get the AI model working for a new social platform in any language. So especially in South Africa, where there are multiple languages used, very many languages, this would be something which is very useful.
It's interesting. There's lots of questions coming in, and I'm going to come to them in a minute because they are reflecting some of the points that I think we need to move on to. But I want to ask Avani, within the data rights sphere, where you're having to balance issues like privacy, security, and free speech, and I guess I have to add to that nuance. Are you comfortable with machines moderating content?
I think there are a number of challenges that come up with it, Karen. And I think under international law, when we talk about restricting rights, there's a 3-part test that we provide for. It must be provided for in law, it must be necessary, and it must be proportionate. And I really commend Utopia Analytics on following the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But I'm not sure that all platforms or all similar providers necessarily do the same. So we're very much at the whim of the AI providers on the one hand, and two, the parameters set by the companies themselves. When we talk, for example, about moderating hate speech, there is no internationally accepted definition of what constitutes hate speech. And so legitimate content may be removed based on the very cautious or overbearing nature of the platforms themselves, which creates huge implications for the right to freedom of expression. I think similarly with the right to privacy, a lot of the data is being collected and that is being generated online raises very significant privacy concerns. Whilst data protection frameworks try to address some of these challenges from a privacy lens, that only deals with personal information relating to a specified individual. And I think there's very serious concerns that go beyond that personal information for non-personal information that's also collected as well.
I've got a lot of questions I want to pick up from that, but let's dispense with the data issue and the data preservation and storage issue, because obviously in South Africa we have a law, the Protection of Personal Information Act, which prescribes, as does legislation in many other parts of the world, including Europe, how basic international data protection principles, and it includes how data should be repurposed, can it be repurposed, and how should it be stored. What do you do with the data once you've finished with it, Mari-Sanna?
When we finish?
Well, if this is a constant process and you're gathering data and does that become your property? That data become your property, and the learnings that effectively feed your algorithm. Perhaps there are new words that get added to that. That's really valuable data. Is that something that you own and you store ad infinitum, or what sort of rules are you subject to?
Mm-hmm. First of all, we are an EU company, so we need to follow the GDPR, the privacy legislation in EU, which is rather strict. There are many similarities with the legislation you have in South Africa. And we ourselves, we don't collect any data from anywhere. So all data what we have is received from the customer companies who want to get their content moderated, and they define the moderation policy. So we receive every single piece of data from them, and that data has been provided by the users to their platform. We moderate, and then we give the response whether to accept or decline that content. The GDPR defines quite strictly how the data can be processed, how it can be stored, how it has to be deleted. If the user wants the data to be deleted, how it needs to be done. And naturally, we follow all these clauses. So, for example, if we don't anymore have a customer relationship with our customer, then the data needs to be deleted after that. But otherwise, we need to have information during the service about the improper content which has been on the platform, because otherwise our AI wouldn't learn what is considered as improper content. And that's why the customer companies usually don't want to delete that content which is considered as improper, to have records on what everything is seen as wrong, and those will be then used to train the AI.
Something I just want to pick up on that, because actually it ties in with a question that Monica Rovik is putting to you. She's described it as an amazing panel, so obviously a lot of interest there. And she said, you know, are you able to highlight people who might be a danger to themselves or others? For example, if they're a suicide risk or an imminent threat, because that's a really difficult question in terms of receiving that data, and are you able to effectively do something with it? Because that would be repurposing it, wouldn't it? Or are there some certain overrides?
Yeah, that is one part of the moderation we do. So, for example, one of our customers, Momia, who provides a platform for kids, they have this kind of feature on their moderation policy. So one of the things we notice with our AI, according to their human decisions as the training data, is that if there is a self-harm kind of comment on what the kid sends to the platform. So in that case, we would label that as self-harm, and that kid would receive a message that we now see that you are feeling not all right. Would you like to talk to an adult? And that message wouldn't be published to the other kids on the platform.
Is there an override? So some companies that I've had dealings with here, they'll use artificial intelligence to be able to sift through the huge masses of data. But ultimately, it gets put to a crowd. Some of the nuanced data gets put to a crowd, and there's a separate level of filtration. Is that what you do? Is there always a human override button at the end of the machine, if you like?
Our AI, well, there are different tools as discussed. Our AI works in a way that it is a tool. There's always a human who defines what is good content, what is bad content on that specific platform. And our AI is used as a tool to do the actual routine work, to do the basic moderation. If there are more difficult cases, new kind of content, new kind of intermediate cases, humans need to make the decisions and then give that for the AI to learn more. So as we see the discussions evolve over time, so humans need to be on track and define how the new kind of situations are handled. And then the AI learns from that. So AI never defines what is hate speech as such, or what is bad behavior. That we need human skills to do that.
At the end of the day, though, and we'll probably get into more detail of this as the conversation progresses, is one of the things, and I know Avani's nodded towards it, is the concern about the design of the algorithm and the programming, and whether there are inbuilt biases. Because when, you know, the program's got to decide what is hate speech, what is not. How do you actually deal with those biases, or are you effectively acquiring biases from the training data when you first move into a company, that those are effectively baked in, and once they're baked in, they're really difficult to bake out, if you like?
There are many ways of doing that. So, for example, every time when we build a new AI model from the data we receive from the customer, we look at how it looks. And if we notice that there's something that shouldn't be there, we will let the customer know and ask them to remoderate that content. Our AI also learns what is the general moderation policy, and it then notices if there are outliers. So it says that this was wrongly moderated by humans. And it also notices if different humans have been moderating in a different way. And trust me, this is something that happens very often. So I have almost never seen a platform where the human moderators would moderate in the same way compared to each other. So there are huge differences between the human. And I think there is quite a lot of bias involved. And that is something we need to notice when we build the first AI models. But also there are other things. So, for example, very many moderation solutions use user reputation as part of the model. And in my opinion, that's no good. Because if you think about a message coming to the platform from a user who yesterday didn't behave well and some of the content was moderated, and the very same, exactly the same message coming from another user who has been behaving well last few weeks, the other message, which is the same, would be moderated out from the platform and the other one would be published. In my opinion, this is no fair, and it would be against the United Declaration of Human Rights, equal treatment. So our models, we never use user background information for moderating this kind of discussions.
I'm just wondering, Avani, if this gives you a little bit more reassurance, because one of the things that Mari-Sanna's just picked up on is this amplification effect that comes with algorithms. Mari-Sanna, to put it in context, in South Africa, we've had some examples where a hashtag may go viral on a platform such as Twitter, not because there's a lot of engagement, but because people reshare it and they engage with the subject matter, and that subject matter may be encouraging racist or xenophobic views. And it's simply because of the reshares and because the way the algorithm is built that then has a kind of multiplier effect. And it gives a platform, if you like, to a person or an individual or a view, which in the real world, they may not normally enjoy. They may only have a very small audience. Let me put this to Avani first. Are some of the safeguards that Mari-Sanna has talked about, do they provide you with some reassurance? Or in light of what we've experienced in South Africa, are you still concerned?
So I think I should start by saying that I fully support the benefits that AI can provide, and I take nothing away from the potential that it offers to achieve really meaningful solutions. I think in practice, the difficulty is that we've seen so many concerning results. So for example, when Microsoft launched its chatbot on Twitter, within a day, the chatbot was called Tay, I think. Within a day, it was spewing out racist and Nazi propaganda. We know the other classic example is Amazon's recruitment process, where based on the past 10 years of recruitment data, the algorithm preferred male candidates over female candidates, which was inimical to its transformation policy and the changes that we wanted to see in the companies. So I think a lot of good work is being done to improve the way the challenges that we've seen in the past and the problems that we've been experiencing. I suppose I still have some remnant concerns about whether or not there is an appropriate standard being set at the international level, or a common standard that's being accepted across the different service providers as to whether or not these concerns can be remedied and alleviated. I think there's good work being done by certain standard setting boards. Civil society launched the Toronto Declaration in 2018, Amnesty International and Access Now, which dealt specifically with the elimination of bias and the promotion of equality in machine learning processes. But there's been slow uptake in terms of these principles, and we're largely at the hands of the individual companies to determine how, when, and if they want to implement it.
We have to remember here that building a high-quality AI tool is actually rocket science. So very many companies try, and they even publish their algorithms and their tools, and then we notice how they work. And it needs huge amount of experience and skills to build AI tools that really work. And that is a big difference between like real AI, advanced AI, and all the rest that work sometimes and other times they don't work.
So Mari-Sanna, if I'm a company and I'm shopping around for a good AI-enabled content moderating company, how do I weed out the good ones from the bad ones? What should I be looking out for, other than the sign up to the UN Declaration of Human Rights? But what really should I be looking out for in terms of the kind of quality controls that you use?
Yeah, I think it is the same than when you buy a car or do any other purchase. You want to see other people's recommendations. So companies that have been using the tool long, how they think, how it works. So that might be one of the most important things. And of course, you need to check if the details, if you are, you know about the tech more, how the different kind of things have been implemented. And then testing. So many companies provide a way to test. We, for example, need only 2 weeks to build the AI model, and then it is in the high production quality. So it is very easy to start this test, and then you can test for 1 month and you see how it works. So in your real environment, it might be the best way.
We have a question from Anne Brown to you, Mari-Sanna, and she's asked, how are the humans selected to monitor hate speech? So how are those human oversight panels, if you like? How do you choose them?
We have just had published a report with Finnish Ministry of Justice about hate speech on Finnish social media on very many different platforms in Finland. And there we specifically focused on hate speech, not improper content in general. And then we noticed one of the results was that it is very, very difficult to be objective and give those right and correct decisions. First of all, you need to define, as I said earlier, you need to define what is hate speech and what is not. And there is not that such a thing that a global definition for hate speech. So it's different from country to country, from situation to situation, and different people think differently. But you need to first make definition, and it needs quite a lot of skills to do that definition only. In our case, we then had a researcher who labeled social media comments according to whether they are hate speech or not. And there you need a lot of skills to understand the meanings in the comments and all the nuances and hidden meanings and whatever there can be. So it's difficult. It needs definitely people who know and understand like bigger things and political points of view and other things happening.
How do you do that then if you are working globally and often conversations online are so context specific, and the big companies like Facebook and Twitter have been criticized for not having enough localized presence, so they don't understand the nuances, and often it'll be very, very subtle. So, again, people use the word cockroaches, in a wildlife discussion, it may have one context. If you talk about that in other parts of the world, say Rwanda, it has a very different context. You see stuff on some of the platforms here that uses the phrase "these people," which is nasty racial overtones. How do you get around that, given the fact that you're in Finland, potentially selling products to South Africa, and not necessarily knowing some of those touchstone issues here? And I'm not being disrespectful by saying that, but it would be the same in any other country in the world. Yeah. How do you get around that?
Yeah, for us, it is very important that we don't define what is good and what is bad. So our customers define it themselves. And I personally would very strongly recommend to have a very skilled individual to be the person who uses the AI tool. And then to use the AI tool is quite important, because then you can have all the routine work done by an AI, and that's skilled in one individual or few individuals to focus on the more difficult cases and those which are those you need to debate over and decide what to do. And you may even change your mind that a few months earlier you accepted something, now you don't do it anymore because the world changes around us. It's very important that no one else comes to your platform and says that what should be improper on your platform. So in my opinion, we can't be a company who would define good and bad everywhere in the world. So it needs to be in a way that every single company defines it themselves. We just scale it in the big volumes with our tech.
I want to ask you both a question about accountability. Now, if you think of a traditional newsroom, whether it's a newspaper or a broadcast newsroom, there's a news editor there whose job is to effectively moderate output, moderate content. And frankly, when they get it wrong, they get hauled before various professional bodies and they are held to account. How do you hold an algorithm to account? Avani, I'm going to put that to you first. Mari-Sanna in a minute.
So just specifically on the example of newsrooms, and then we'll chat about more broadly, I think it's one of the interesting recommendations I've seen from a UNESCO report is that it's actually time, because of the prevalence of using algorithms, of using artificial intelligence to curate content or moderate content, it's time for professional bodies to update their press codes and other similar documents to deal precisely with this issue. So that if, for example, your comment is removed improperly or the content that you're receiving you think is impermissible, you do still have recourse to the professional bodies within the self-regulatory models that we've established for the media. But more broadly, I think accountability remains one of the biggest gaps when we talk about artificial intelligence, and that's partly because of the voluntary codes that don't necessarily establish accountability measures, and perhaps a slight reluctance. So just to pick up on one of the questions that came up in the chat room, which ties to this. The Protection of Personal Information Act does deal specifically with automated decision-making, and as a general principle prohibits decisions taken on by purely automated means, subject to certain exceptions. So for example, if there's a contract in place and the outcome is to the benefit of the data subject, that is permissible. The second is if it's not to the benefit of the data subject, to enable that person to be able to make representations and to be informed of the underlying logic of the decision that was taken, which implies some measure of transparency and accountability. And to the extent that that's not complied with, you would then have recourse to the information regulator to be able to take it forward. And if I can just pick up on one last point, from an accountability perspective, the European Commission earlier this year published its draft regulation around the harmonization of rules on artificial intelligence. And there it seeks to establish, for example, a European Artificial Intelligence Board, and the providers or the users of artificial intelligence mechanisms would be subject to quite significant fines, so up to 300 million euros for the most egregious violations, up to 6% of annual turnover. So we are seeing measures, efforts to try and achieve greater accountability, but I think we're still quite a way off from seeing that realized in practice.
Mari-Sanna, can we audit your algorithms? Is that something that's actually possible? Or, how would you feel if there was a question about doing that?
Yeah, when thinking who is in charge in practice when you build an AI tool, I think it is divided in two parts. So the first part is the data. AI always needs some kind of training data. And those humans who make the moderation decisions in the past, they were responsible for those decisions. So if they made something wrong earlier, then if it is noticed, that needs to be fixed. So humans, the persons who are in charge of the moderation policy are in charge of the data. Then the party who provides the AI tool, the AI algorithm, is in charge on the quality of the AI tool. There are lots and lots and lots of technical things that may go wrong. They can go wrong tomorrow. So that company needs to take care of the quality, how the AI tools, as you know, IT breaks every now and then. It's quite difficult to keep them working. So that's something needs to be done by the AI party. And then there's the user. So if you have the perfect data, if you have the perfect tool, but then you use it in the wrong way, you get wrong behavior from the tool. So the user is responsible for following the user instructions. And if they notice something wrong, then they find out where to fix it. So it is actually quite straightforward in my opinion that those who are skilled in building the algorithms and who build the algorithms, they are responsible for that. And they need to build the unbiased models, and they need to build the best possible AI algorithms from the data they receive. But they can't be responsible for the data. So the data is provided by the human moderators, and they are responsible for that.
But given the concerns about baked-in biases, is there a way to be able to verify your algorithm and to understand the processes upon which that algorithm is designed?
We, of course, every time when we build an AI model, we check how the algorithm works. The algorithms are very complex. So you need like many years training to understand what the different kind of things mean, what come out from the tool. I think the best way is to use test data. So you just have new comments and you test how the system works, and you read them through manually and compare your decision to the AI decision. So then you know how different kinds of situations have been handled.
Avani, I wonder if you can elaborate on this point a little bit and whether there is sort of a human rights concern within this. We've all had instances when we've been involved in automated systems, where, you know, whether it's ringing the bank, whether it's trying to ring a company to be able to get some kind of service, and effectively computer says no, you don't have the right data that's being put in to match the algorithm, and you effectively get locked out because your credentials don't match. In real terms, there's normally someone that you can appeal to if the computer says no. Are there concerns that actually within the virtual environment that recourse simply doesn't exist?
Absolutely. And I think for me, that's probably the biggest, or one of the biggest concerns. And again, it's very much up to the individual company who approaches Utopia to create the algorithm to determine whether or not there is any kind of recourse at the end of it. We've seen for example, with platforms like the big platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on, a reluctance to share information about how the algorithms will be used to moderate content. We've seen with marketing agencies a reluctance to show how targeted advertising potentially works. So the difficulty is that there isn't a human at the end of the line. And part of the challenge, I think, is that we don't always know when it is that we're being affected by artificial intelligence. So we don't necessarily know when it's a human who's making the decisions for us, or when it's an algorithm determining things like our credit score or our refugee status, which is one of the very significant human rights concerns coming up now, is whether or not AI can determine a real refugee from a different type of foreign national migrant. So there's a plethora of concerns that arise from some of these challenges. And in the absence of an effective framework governing accountability, in the absence of, I think, real meaningful engagement on how the algorithms and the users of the algorithms can be held to account, there's a significant accountability deficit that we're finding at the moment. And I think, these conversations are moving quickly and with quite a bit of steam in the EU and in other jurisdictions, but there's been a lag in the African context. As I mentioned earlier, POPI goes some of the way, the Protection of Personal Information Act goes some of the way in trying to achieve accountability, but even the language is quite outdated. It's not contemporary language, and it's not sufficient for us to have proper, meaningful, holistic recourse when these challenges and shortcomings arise.
We've got some great questions coming in on some of the futuristic issues, but just before I turn to those, can I ask you something based on that point that Avani's just made, Mari-Sanna? The tech industry is making inroads to try and engage actively on these issues, and states are involved in high-level discussions. South Africa is very much at the forefront of those for the region on various different cyber-related issues. But when it comes to ethical AI and it comes to balancing security, privacy, and freedom of speech, which are fairly political issues, it's been really hard to come up with a common definition. Are you finding that as well with the companies that you are dealing with? That actually, whether you talk to a company in Finland and you're then talking to a company in China, one in South Africa, maybe one in India, maybe one in Latin America, that actually there's very, very different views about those boundaries, if you like, between freedom of speech, security, and privacy.
There are differences. Some differences are even that large that, in my opinion, the UN Declaration of Human Rights is not followed. So that's not then about how to follow, but whether to follow or not. In these problems on whether the tech works and if it makes a mistake, how to complain and what to do then, and whether there are humans in the line, I totally agree that there are a huge amount of problems. And I see, as a person who provides technologies, that it's about the quality. So if you provide high quality technology, you can't leave it running on its own. There has to be a human on the loop all the time, every day, and then also in developing the systems. And it's only a question of quality and how much money is used to keep the quality high. And that is related to other big companies you mentioned and all the rest. So it's the question of quality. You are able to do high quality AI tools, which then are backed up with humans if you have enough resources to do so.
Right. I have got a fantastic futuristic question to put to you. It's come from Monica Rovik. I think this is really interesting because we've talked about moderation of text. But she said, are there AI tools able to chat beyond that? So are you looking to chat at both still and moving images, or are these features coming? So at the moment, are you just looking at moderating text, or can you moderate images and other types of media?
Utopia AI moderator moderates also images and is able to moderate videos. But about videos, it is rather complex. There are many reasons why it's technically quite advancing. But parts of those can be moderated almost in real time. So is
it the same principle? We had a really interesting discussion on our webinar last time around all about deep fakes. Is that one of the big issues? And deep fakes, by the way, is the manipulation of video and visual data. Is that one of the challenges that you're having to overcome in terms of moderating in this sphere?
Yeah, if we talk about deep fakes on media houses where they decide whether to publish that kind of videos or not, whether they are true videos or fake videos. So I think that's not a big issue. Creating a deep fake video is quite demanding, and when you create one that is difficult to make a distinction between the real and fake version, it's even more demanding. So it needs a lot of skills, it needs a lot of time, it needs a lot of technology to create those things which look real, and they can't be many of those around. So I think much bigger problem in these fake videos is that someone takes a video and then says that it was taken in another time or another place than what was actually the place and time and the people or whatever on the video. So that's the biggest issue currently. Of course, technology develops, but it will take many years before we have deep fake videos, which would be a lot of risk for us.
Can I ask a question of you as well? I mean, if you're moderating content on, say, a newspaper site, and often there are the same sort of comments that come up time and time again, given the fact that algorithms are based on patterns, is there a danger that you screen out minority views? So the other views. So I understand on the same way that there may be, you will look for abnormalities in the pattern that might flag up a piece of hate speech, for example. Is there the danger that you're effectively, we used to use the word dumbing down in newsrooms, but you're actually reducing the topics of engagement, for example, if it's a comments page for a newspaper, to sort of the lowest common denominator, and you're not actually introducing new ideas? Isn't that the danger? Isn't that the danger with an algorithm that looks at existing patterns?
There's always this danger, but it's not the danger of using the algorithm, but it's the danger of the full moderation concept. So basically, if human moderators are able to be fair and treat all the minorities and all the parties in the same way, then the algorithm learns to do the same. So the algorithm doesn't create the problems there. In the opposite, it is actually taking the decisions that are different from the usual decisions out from the, if using some kind of advanced AI, what Utopia provides. But
so
yes,
can I interrupt then? No, can I interrupt then? So why, for example, with the Brazilian client, so you've got a Brazilian platform that's been very successful, that I know you use a case study, that actually there's been more and more engagement as a result of using your AI tools. Is that because you're amplifying certain views that come out of that, or how can that generate more comments and more engagement? I don't understand that.
Yeah, on pre-moderated sites, so on those sites where the moderation is done before the content is published, this just speeds up the process. So if you type your comment, it's moderated within a second and it is then published on this page. It means that others see it right away and there becomes lively discussion instead of waiting 1 hour or 1 day after the comment is published. It is just the speed. I don't think it is anything else.
Avani, you're our regulatory lady. We've got a question now from Mark Hayink, and it says, do you think that given geography and time lags, courts as we know them can ever be an answer? Is there any movement to provide cross-border regulation that is more agile and can create enforceable regulation?
It's a great question. And I think, the challenge is the jurisdictional scope of courts. So as a lawyer, I like to believe the law is a tool, but it's obviously not a silver bullet. It's not the complete answer. For many of the platforms, if you want to seek recourse before jurisdiction, they're domiciled in California or the European Union. So from a South African perspective, litigating these issues is incredibly challenging and probably quite hollow at the end of it. Whether there will be a stronger move towards cross-border regulation is something that I really hope for. I'm not sure that regulating this type of technology is a complete answer either, because the technology is advancing and evolving so quickly. And as we've seen with some of the criticisms of the European Union or the European Commission's legislation, the terminology is not up to date. The definitions are slightly defunct. And there's been a little bit of pushback around whether or not a law is necessarily the answer versus more fluid standards. I would strongly advocate for at least a regional standard on artificial intelligence, and something similar to what the European Commission is doing, where it seeks to have extraterritorial application. So not just holding accountable those who are based within the geographic borders, but also those who sell and use artificial intelligence tools within the countries. I think would be a tremendous benefit, and also I think a significant safeguard against the misuse and perpetration of human rights violations that we have the potential to see without this.
I agree. All of us, we think that it is just fair that, for example, cars, what they are, how they work, what kind of technologies they can be, are highly regulated. Why wouldn't we have the same for all the other kinds of technology which affects us, how our lives are? So definitely the regulations are needed.
We have another question, if I may, to Shefsil Hadebe. Shefsil says, in the African context, AI has proven quite problematic, especially with issues such as AI bias being at the top. Do you give any consideration to African values and norms in the design and implementation of AI? Mari-Sanna, I know you've talked about the fact that it's largely down to the training data and what's sort of baked in at the start, but could you answer Chipiso's question, please?
Yeah,
Finnish company offering tech to South Africa. I know that's not what you're doing, but Jess, how would you answer them? So I think it's a very reasonable question.
Yeah, I answered the same what I already said, that it's the question of the skills of the individuals, the human moderators, who define what is good or what is bad. The AI itself doesn't know anything. It learns from the humans how to do the things, and it just learns that from the examples how humans have been doing it before the AI, and then the AI does the same behind on the same footsteps.
It doesn't amplify it. Can I just be absolutely clear in my mind? The tools do not amplify, because this has been an issue that we've seen on some of the other platforms, that algorithms have the ability to amplify content that otherwise in the real world would not have the same platform.
If we talk about these hashtags, it's if the first message was moderated properly in the first place, the amplification wouldn't happen. So that problem comes only because of the lack of the moderation. So many of the problems we see related to artificial intelligence are, first of all, they are totally different kind of algorithms than the moderation algorithms. So if you see a vacuum robot behaving in a certain way, it doesn't mean that the moderation algorithm would have the same problem. It won't have. It will have its own problems because it is a different app, different program code. Besides the quality of the data, there is the quality of the AI also, quality of the technology.
And maybe just to add to that, I think going back to your previous question, if there were greater transparency around the quality of the algorithm, if we saw, and I fully take the point that it's incredibly complex, but I think if there were greater transparency about the parameters being used, we would have more comfort as to what considerations are getting taken into account to remove content, and would have a better understanding of when and if we should seek to appeal the decisions being taken or review or seek recourse against it. But because of the opacity that we're currently dealing with, the bias, we have these concerns about bias, and we have these concerns about rights violations. And those aren't being fully addressed because we simply don't know.
So what incentive is there for companies to actually be more opaque? Because actually, unless you're all doing it, there is obviously a sense of vulnerability, commercial vulnerability, and it's a hugely competitive space. I'm just wondering, again, a question to both of you, maybe Mari-Sanna first. What incentive is there for tech companies to basically show their hand and to effectively expose the inner workings of their algorithms?
Mm-hmm. If you do that, then all the others repeat what you do, and then you don't have your product anymore. So it is, I think, in most of the cases, it is the question of competition. The competitors understand much better than the lay people what those things mean, and they can replicate it if you reveal it. I suppose it's the biggest thing why those are not revealed. So you want to keep your own business as your own. It's a money thing. But another thing is, as said already, that even though I revealed the parameters of the algorithm, which I can now say 2, 27, 13, 69, and so on, it means nothing to a person who doesn't know everything. So then you would need to open all your program code to everyone, and then you wouldn't have your business anymore. So it's a
toughie.
Yeah, it's tough. So then you need to have other means to do that. For example, we always provide the possibility to test our tools. We provide our tools in a way that our customers always see how it behaves. So we are not doing anything in the background. So they always see what kind of decisions have been made, and we provide it in a form that it's easy to measure what's going on and analyze what's going on and compare to the human decisions and so on. So I think this is the way how the algorithms are taken into use on the platforms. It is one of the big questions in this accountability.
Avani, I mean, I know sometimes regulation doesn't always work, particularly in a space where the technology is developing so quickly. But could you see a sort of kite marking system working where effectively companies like Utopia that says, you know, we're going to be open, we're going to be transparent, we adhere to ethical AI principles, that they get a kite mark that would put them and elevate them as part of their brand status? Could you see that working?
Yeah, I potentially. You know, we've heard a number of times from different platforms and providers that unethical business models are just bad for business, which, you know, may or may not be true. But I think it's a big ask to trust that will necessarily be the case. I don't mean. And I don't want to cast aspersions on companies, the way that they use the AI. But I think there are significant concerns about how these models are being implemented. So for example, last year, Facebook announced that it is going to be increasing its artificial intelligence usage, AI usage for content moderation. And there are significant benefits. It can prioritize certain content, as opposed to going in sequential order as we're currently seeing with the human moderators. But when pushed as to how it will determine what's important, what will be the defining factors as to what gets taken down, what gets amplified, and so on, the conversation shut down quite quickly. And I think that's not a unique scenario that we're seeing. So yes, absolutely. I think regulation is part of the solution, and potentially competition authorities, authorities established with a particular aim in mind, such as this new European AI board, which may be established, will be able to receive the information on a confidential basis and audit it for compliance with international human rights standards. But unfortunately, we're just not there yet, and that's not what we're currently seeing.
Very interesting. Well, we're nearly at the end of our discussion. I just want to give each of you an opportunity just to offer some sort of final remarks. In terms of the direction of travel, Mari-Sanna, this idea of a European board that will try and sort of open up greater transparency, is that something that you would subscribe to? Is that something that you would applaud?
Transparency is very important, and of course all the humans and the companies, the platforms need to follow the legislation, and there is definitely something to define more in the legislation. These kind of technologies are new. We haven't been used to them yet, like we have been used to the things which happen in our physical lives. So the same kind of decisions need to be made in the online lives. And AI is the future anyways. So we will use AI tools. They will help us in very many things. And the only thing to consider there is to build the AI tools in a way that they help us, not make our world worse than it was before.
And Avani, I know the conversations in South Africa go beyond sort of artificial intelligence use for moderating. There are big debates at the moment about CCTV cameras, about centralized biometric databases. We haven't got time to touch upon these issues itself, but do you lie awake at night and worry about this brave new world? Or are you more of a pragmatist and think actually, we can work with it? As Mari-Sanna said, it's here to stay. We just need to be able to manage it better.
I definitely lay awake last night thinking a lot about this, but I believe in the potential of it. I just think we are on a very concerning path at the moment that is an unaccountable, untransparent, poorly transparent one. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I really commend Daily Maverick and yourself, Karen, for having this conversation, because it's such an important issue and one that we need to pay more attention to. As South Africa talks about the fourth industrial revolution, AI is going to become more prevalent in South Africa. I read a great article yesterday in preparation that ended with, "May the algorithms forever be in your favor." So I hope that for all the listeners as well.
Both of you, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. A big thank you to Dr. Mari-Sanna Paukkeri of Utopia Analytics, who's been speaking to us deep in the countryside of Finland, and Avani Singh, South African lawyer and data rights activist. Thank you both for being my panelists. And of course, we must extend our thanks to our sponsor of this webinar and our cybersecurity series, the company F-Secure. So until next time, go well and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.